Class tonight is on presenting comparables, presenting CMAs, comps, whatever you might want to call them. Now, here's something I want you to remember. 70% of listings are lost in how you present the comparables. You can say everything right about yourself, about Fillmore, about Fillmore's differentiators, but if you don't present the comps in the appropriate fashion, you're going to lose the listing. Okay? And remember, the presenting of comparables happen at the end of the presentation. Any discussion about commissions, any discussion about numbers, have to happen at the end of the listing appointment. There's a simple reason for that. If you get into the topic of pricing early on in conversation, and the seller doesn't like your numbers, or doesn't like the numbers that you present, they're not listening to anything else for the entire evening, or the entire afternoon. Be aware of that. There's a couple of key points that I'm really going to emphasize with materials tonight, so be aware. Okay, first of all, preparation is the key. And, you know, the reality is that, and I'm being realistic with this, for a new agent or for someone who doesn't have a large following, a large sphere of influence, you might only go on 15, 20 listing appointments over the course of a year. So you want to make sure that you capitalize on every opportunity that comes up. And that's why preparation is very, very important. Now let's start off with some basic things. There are effectively 4 different types of comps that you want to try to go ahead, research, and present. The first type of comp that you want to present, and I would try to present this particular comp first, is expireds. Expireds. Let me ask a global question. Why do you think you want to present expireds? Yes. Okay. The answer was right on point. You want to show expireds because 95% of the reason why properties expire is because they were overpriced. So you want to demonstrate to the seller what happens when a property is overpriced. They languish on the market, and as a result, they expire. So it's a very, very important comp to present. Another comp that you want to present, which is, you know, everyone knows this, are properties that were on the market and that went ahead, sold, and closed. So they were on the market, they sold and closed. Another type of comp that you want to present are properties that are currently on the market. Currently on the market. And the fourth type of comp is sometimes difficult to get your hands on, and probably the only way you're going to be able to get your hands on it is if someone in your office has taken a listing and has it under contract. Those are properties that are currently under contract. Under contract. Not closed, but under contract. Why is that comp probably the most viable out of all of these?
Because of the price range of the comp showing how she's going to see that actually is in the contract, and that would be the right range.
Okay, that too. It's most current. It's the most current. It's the most current. So that's most reflective of the market. Now, it goes without saying that all of these comps have similarities insofar as they're in the same neighborhood, like-in-kind properties. You know, if it's a single-family property and it's a Cape Cod, you want to be having Cape Cods in your comps.
Yes.
Your question? Make sure that you compare and contrast like and kind elements in the property as well. Okay. One very important thing. You know, many sellers, when you're presenting comps, say, but I went ahead and I put this tile in here, or this marble here, did this or that. We call it bonusing. You bonus value-added elements in that seller's property, and you really want to minus elements that don't add value. There's certain types of things that add value to a property, and many things that are nice, but a lot of people don't necessarily buy into. What are some things that you think almost get dollar for dollar back? Kitchens, updated kitchens, updated baths. new roofs, a new heating element in the property. You know, floors are a little bit dicey. If someone put in marble floors, not everybody likes marble floors. You know, a finished basement almost always gets dollar for dollar. You know, things like built-ins, tile work, they don't always get dollar for dollar. So you want to be able to point that out. A new roof is a great example where you can almost get dollar for dollar every single time. Okay? So be careful about comparing the tests. Yes.
I have a question.
Yeah.
It's like a couple of years ago, I sold a property, they were right next to each other. The first one was a one family, sold for $300,000. The one next to it, the homeowner totally renovated, new clothes, new whatever, everything upgraded, and it was appraised for the same.
It was appraised for the same?
Yes.
Well, sometimes appraisers are lazy, and you know that doesn't make any sense to me. What was the time frame difference when these properties were sold?
And it was like about 2 months or a month apart.
So, something strange there. There had to be some other detracting factors from the other property. There had to be. You said that just wouldn't happen.
Because normally they said it doesn't matter how much you put into your house, it usually goes based on the sales of the houses in the neighborhood. And if you have a house that's burned down, why should, you know?
You're 100% right, and that's why. Everybody, please, let's have courtesy. Let's have courtesy for people who are asking questions and other people in the room who want to hear the answers to the questions that are asked, okay? Please. And this way we'll move through this quickly. Let me dwell on that for 1 second. Sometimes appraisers are lazy. Because appraisers, whether you guys know it or not, get paid per appraisal. So the more appraisals they do in one day, the more money they make. Now, if I was the listing agent and the appraiser came in and appraised that my property at the same value as a property that didn't have the elements and upgrades, I would go ahead and run comps and send them or bring them to the appraiser because appraisers are lazy. Okay? And that's why I was talking to Gus upstairs, and Gus just did that, similar situation, and he was able to get the appraiser to come up and include some of the other comps. So just bear that in mind. Yes?
There's a question. Backyard stuff like a jacuzzi or a pool, is that like better or is it a wash?
Pools, not necessarily. Pools, maybe 50, 60 cents on the dollar. You know, jacuzzis, maybe a little bit higher. A jacuzzi in the house, yes, but a jacuzzi in the backyard, not necessarily. So you have to, you know, essentially educate the seller.
Right, because you go there and say, oh, look.
Exactly. Well, look at this custom tile work that I did, you know, with the fruits and vegetables in the kitchen. Not everybody likes that. Okay? So, right. Right.
Say that doesn't really add value.
Right, and you know, you got to be careful what you say. But one way to say that, is to say it's beautiful. The work, the craftsmanship that you put in here is absolutely gorgeous. However, not everybody's tastes are the same. And when an appraiser comes in, they're only going to value it based upon generic appreciation. Okay? Was there another question? Question?
Even when you have a situation, say, updated bath, which usually does bring in more money.
Yep.
Sometimes it could be over-improved. So
Sometimes
you could
it can be.
What
Great
do you
point.
do in a case where, for example, you go to see a homeowner and he says, well, I just redid my bath, but you know that he spent much more money than you could bring in.
Yeah, and it's true. And that's something, it's a very astute comment, you have to explain that away to the seller. It may be over-improved. Okay? Now remember, when you do have these comps, you're going to want to be comparing and contrasting each one of these comps to the seller's property. Now if you're fortunate enough to be able to get your hands on comps that are currently under contract, that means you're going to have 4 different types of comps to present. If you can get 2 of each, you know, and maybe 3 of each, and go through them, you know, fairly rapidly with the seller, you have a nice perspective. Okay, so you could have 8, 10, 12 comps. And you know, some people say that's overkill, but in my opinion, this is the largest asset, typically, in the seller's life. So you can't, and the numbers are the most important thing that the seller's looking for, so you can't overkill it. As long as you study them and you know what you're talking about. Question?
What's the relevant look-back period when you're doing expireds and sold and closed? 3 months. Sometimes I hear 3 months,
right.
Thanks, or
yeah,
6 months.
And here's the reality: you want to go back as narrow, short a time as you possibly can in a declining market, which we're still in a declining market. Okay. In a declining market, you want to get as current as you can. But you may have to go back 6, 9, 10 months to find comps that did sell during of like in kind. So, but in this market we're in right now, narrow time frame. In a market when prices are going up, it's just the opposite. Just the opposite. You want to get a wider range. Okay? Question.
How far away from a specific location?
As narrow, as short a distance as you possibly can, but you may have to go wider away to find a comp for a property that's very unusual.
My question is though, are you better off, let's say you're looking at a two-story home, let's say a duplex,
Yeah.
with a certain number of bedrooms, or a two-family, are you better off getting the same exact type of home that's farther away, or a home that's slightly different that's
You want to get
closer?
both. I would get both. In that kind of situation where it's hard to find 2 or 3 comps that are relative nearby, you get a little bit of a mixed bag and you're good to go. Great point. Very good point. Very good. Okay. So now we're down to the third bullet point on the first page. And by the way, for your benefit tonight, we're only going to be here for about an hour, hour and 15 minutes tonight. Okay? Put that on your calendar. Remember, just don't pull comps from the Brooklyn MLS and Fillmore site. Physically go and visit the properties if you can. Most realtors are very lazy. They're lazy. They just pull the comps. If you're wise and you're prudent, what you really should do is, if there's properties that are currently on the market, you should visit them all. Visit them. And here's the reason why. I want you just to envision this. You're in the seller's property. You're sitting at the listing table, if you will, at their dining room table, and you get into a dialogue as you're presenting the comps, and for you to say, I was just in this property 2 days ago. It has a lot more weight than if you just talked about pieces of paper. So try, if you possibly can, try and visit the comps. Now, obviously, you're not going to be able to get into properties that were sold. You may be able to get into properties that are currently under contract, especially if it's one of your associates that took that listing. You're probably not going to be able to get into properties that were expired unless they're back on the market now. If they're back on the market, go and visit them. Go that extra yard, the seller will appreciate it. Also, you should always include for sale by owners in your comp presentation. It's easy for you and I to get into for sale by owner properties. Not difficult. Just call up the for sale by owner, let the for sale by owner know that you're previewing properties for a buyer of yours, and go in under that pretense, and then you'll be able to go ahead and include that for sale by owner in your comparable presentation. Many realtors forego that. They're lazy. They just go and they pull them from the MLS, and you're not going to find for sale by owners on the MLS. Everybody okay with that?
Wait, then you tell the owner that this is a FISBO?
Absolutely. Say what? Yeah, oh, yes, definitely.
You tell him?
Definitely.
So maybe then you're putting an idea in his head that he should also do it.
No, because you're going to be schooled and compelling enough to convince him that he shouldn't go for sale by owner for all the reasons that we talked about in the last class.
Most of them are
Right?
overpriced.
Okay? And a lot of them are overpriced. Here's the point. The whole point of sharing with the seller that you took the time and energy to go out and evaluate all of the properties that are currently on the market, not just those in the MLS. A lot of realtors don't do that. And what your goal is here is to try to separate yourself during your listing presentation from the other realtors that are out there. You're competing against all these other realtors. So you want to differentiate yourself by showing these sellers that you're prepared to go the extra distance for them. All right. Last point on page 1. Never get into a price discussion with the seller over the phone. The sellers may say to you, before you come out, do you have a sense of what my property might be worth? You always want to decline an answer to that. And one comfortable way of doing that is to say to the seller, until I get to visit your property, walk it, and get a sense of all the outstanding elements in the property, there's just no way that I'm prepared to talk about the price. So always push off the notion of discussing price over the phone until you have an opportunity to walk the property and to view all those elements that may differentiate and make it special. Okay? It's a simple thing to say. All right. That's the answer to the top point on page number 2. Turn to page 2. Again, just to reiterate, at the seller's property, we're on page 2. At the seller's property, never get into a price discussion or commission discussion early on. It's a lose-lose scenario. Why? Because if you give them a commission rate, if you give them a number that they don't like, they're not listening to anything else you're going to say. Sellers oftentimes, for sale by owners, oftentimes over the phone will say to you, so what commission do you charge? You're going to use the same argument. Sir, I'm a professional. Until I get to your property and evaluate it, there's no way that I'm in a position to discuss either the value of the property or the commission that we will be working with. Just push it off till you get there. And then once you get there, you're pushing off any discussion about commissions and pricing till the tail end of the presentation. Yes? Okay. All right. Before presenting comps, this is a very, very important point. Highlight this. I put a little asterisk there. Before presenting the comps, make sure you get into a discussion about the risks of overpricing. This is almost subliminal. Now I want you to think about this. I want you to think strategically. Well, you're sitting down with the seller. They want to hear about the numbers. You're going to be talking first about the market, like we discussed the other night, market talk, the reasons why they want to get in the market, but some of the challenges that are out there, and you want to share with them the risks of overpricing. And you don't want to make it a one-on-one discussion in the sense that you don't want to say that, Mr. Seller, you're going to face these risks if you overprice. The way you should position your statement is that sellers, in general, sellers who choose to overprice their property oftentimes run risks. You're not saying you, Mr. Seller, if you overprice your property, you're running risks. You want to say that there are risks that sellers face in today's market if they overprice their properties. Okay? One risk of overpricing, and you've got to emphasize this, and there's a reason for it. One major risk is that buyers won't even come to your property. Buyers will not come to your property. And why you're saying this in a very, very clear fashion is that once you get the listing and buyers aren't coming to the property, and you did take an overpriced listing, you can point back to that evening when we sat down at your dining room table, and one of the first things that I told you was that if you do choose to overprice your property, you could very well run the risk of not getting buyers to come. Now why don't buyers come to an overpriced property? Say it. They're savvy. Everybody in this room must get this mantra down. It's a very simple mantra. Every time you're talking to a seller, the mantra is that buyers today are very, very savvy. They have as much information at their disposal as we realtors do. It's embarrassing, but buyers today have as much information as we have. Buyers are savvy. That's a mantra everyone must be comfortable with when you're talking to a seller. That buyers are very savvy today, and that happens to be the truth. Buyers are extremely savvy today. As was just mentioned, buyers oftentimes run comps before they even make an offer. Buyers today often ask agents, have you run comps to see what range I should make the offer in? So buyers are very, very savvy. Question?
Doesn't that make you want to overprice the property then in the listing? Because you know the buyers are going to come to strike a deal.
No. Buyers are going, if the seller and the listing agent and the agent who's working with the buyer is smart and savvy, you would have prepared the buyer and you would know what the market value is before you take a buyer out to a property. Listen to me. Before you ever take a buyer out to see a property, everyone in this room had better run comps. Before you ever take a buyer out to see a property, you should run comps. Because you know what the listing price is, but you've got to know what the market value is. So when your buyer the buyer that you're working with, Billy, tries to make a lowball offer, you ask them, how did you come to that offer? How did you come to that number? And they'll say, well, I just want to try it. If you're articulate and you can say, well, I ran comps before we came out to see this property, and you should know that this is the relative market value. Okay? So that's how you guide the buyer. It's a topic for another night. Okay? So one major question.
Yeah, if you include FSBOs in your comps, And FSBOs tend to overprice their properties. Will that drive up basically the value of what you think your house is going to be worth?
Well, now
with them?
let's think about something. I don't know if the notion that FSBOs overprice their properties, I don't know if that's accurate. I don't know if that's accurate. You know, the reason why for sale by owners don't go with realtors is to bring their property down to more of a relative market value because they're not paying a commission. So I don't know if that's necessarily accurate, that for sale by owners overprice their property. Now, there's some for sale by owners, and one reason why there are a portion of some for sale by owners is because they're upside down in their mortgage and they have to get a certain number. They have to get a certain number. Those are the for sale by owners that invariably will overprice their property because they're stuck between the rock and a hard place because they owe more money on their property than what their property is worth. So as a result, they try to get their property on the market at what they owe. Okay? So remember that. Okay, so one risk of overpricing is that buyers won't even come. Number two, another risk of overpricing is that if you overprice, if the seller overprices their property, it's going to make competitive properties look more attractive. Overpricing makes competitive properties or other properties that are on the market more attractive. And does anybody know how many months of inventory of properties are still on the market here in Brooklyn? 9 months. Very good. That's a stat that everybody should have on the tip of their tongue. 9 months of inventory in Brooklyn. 9 months of inventory. Now, for some properties, it may be less. There might be, 7 months of inventory. For some properties, maybe 15 months of inventory. Depends upon the location and where it is. It's a great statistic to have in hand. 9 months of inventory right now in Brooklyn. Okay? A third risk of overpricing is that even if we're able to attain a price that is a seller's home property is overpriced, and we find a buyer who's prepared to buy it at a higher than market value, what's going to happen? It's not going to appraise. It's not going to appraise. Very, very compelling point. It's not going to appraise. Overpriced properties do not appraise. The banks are so gun-shy today. The banks are so nervous. The banks have these appraisers by the throat and say if you're going to err on the side of coming in low, especially in a market that is still is a little bit shaky and there may be some room for it to go down. Okay? So it's a great thing to say to a seller who wants an outrageous price. Even if we attain that price and we found a buyer that's prepared to pay it because they love your property, the buyer's not going to get financing because they won't appraise. It's still a cash deal. This is a cash deal. Yeah, because the bank's got no skin in the game. Yes, question.
Well, also another fact is even if you get the appraisal, banks now work with management companies that appraise the appraisal.
Okay, good.
So now you have another obstacle.
There's another obstacle.
When paying mortgages, so that's
absolutely.
That's normal now.
Absolutely. Now, another risk of overpricing, the fourth risk of overpricing that you want to remember, is that if a property is overpriced, it languishes on the market and it gets stale. Stale is a great word to use with the seller, because the last thing the seller wants is for their property to be stale. So those are the 4 risks of overpricing. 4 risks. Everybody comfortable with that? Yes? On the market, sure. Very good. Excellent point. Kate just mentioned a great point, just to further define that. Buyers know how long properties have been on the market. And when a property's on the market, because it's overpriced, the first thing that buyers wonder is, what's wrong with it? What's wrong with it? And that's the same kind of dialogue, thanks Kate, the same kind of dialogue that you want to use with the seller. Buyers wonder what's wrong with it. Buyers are very, very savvy today. They're very, very savvy today. One quick point, I just want to go back to something. With the comps, with those 4 different types of comps, go back to page 1. Just came to my mind. Please remember this. We're at the second bullet point. All these comps that you present, the 4 different types of comps, remember to also talk about how long those properties were on the market, days on market, and if there were any price reductions. Days on market and price reductions. So when you talk about the expires, obviously they were on the market for 6 months or 5 months, whatever it might be, whatever the listing term was. A property that's currently on the market, it's not enough to talk about what the price of that property is now that it's currently on the market, but how long it's been on the market and how many price reductions. So with every comp that you present, always talk about days on market and if there were any price reductions and the level of price reductions. Okay? All right, let's go back and we're at, we just talked about those 4 bullet points, the risk of overpricing. Okay, so now remember, talking about the last class that we had, if the seller does not have urgency, you want to be able to invoke some market talk to create some urgency. So it's one thing you want to do before you present the comps. Then you want to be able to present the risks of overpricing. Then the next thing that you want to do before you present the comps is you want to get the seller's price opinion. You want to get the seller's price opinion before you present the comps. Why? To find out where their heads are at before you pull out of your folder what the market's saying about the value of the property. You want to know where their temperature is, where their head is at, for a couple of very, very important reasons. Okay? So, and one way to do it, a nice comfortable statement, is not to say what do you think your property's worth, it's to say something along these lines. And remember, as we've said, you want to do this in your own style and your own way and in your own comfort level. I've always felt comfortable saying to the seller, you know, before I came here tonight, folks, you must have had a number in your mind that you wanted to achieve. Why don't you share that with me? Okay? Before I came here this evening, you folks certainly had a number in your mind that you wanted to achieve with the sales price of your house. Why don't you share that with me? And as I said the other night, my experience is that half the time the sellers say, well, you're the expert, you tell me.
Yep.
Or they say, no, you know, they want to play a game. You tell me what you think. You know, I'm not going to tell you. And when they say that, we come back, as I mentioned the other night, is, you know, absolutely, I am the expert. Thanks, I appreciate that. With a big smile on your face, yeah, I am the expert, but you're my customer, you're my client. And in order for me to work towards you reaching your goals and objectives price-wise, I need to know what they are. Let me know what your goals are so I can work towards them. And typically, you get another 25% there. So, but now here's the point. And please, this is the key right here. You're sitting there, and you have the comps in your folder. You're about to, you know, you're 85% done with your presentation. And this is the moment of truth right now. You've got the comps in the folder. You ask them their price opinion. They won't tell you. And you know if they don't tell you, what can you bank on?
Too high.
The number's high. The number's higher than what you have in your folder. If they give you a high number, you know, your comps are between 450 and 500. Your comps are between 450 and 500 in your folder that you haven't revealed. And you ask them for their price opinion, and they say 590, 600. Or they tell you nothing. This is the moment of truth right now. This is the moment of truth. They're looking for a number much higher than you have. Now what you must do is you must set a safety net for yourself. And if there's one thing I want you to remember, not just for the test, but for practicality, is that you must separate yourself from the numbers that you present. These are not your numbers. The comps are not your numbers. You don't own these numbers. These comps that you're presenting is what the market is saying about like and kind properties. These numbers are not yours. They're what the market is saying about the value of that seller's property. Please get those words down. All right, so here's what happens. Follow me on this. So the seller gives you a high number, or they don't give you a number at all. You've got to set a safety net for yourself. And here's the safety net. The safety net is this. You've got to make it extraordinarily clear in the seller's mind that ultimately they will decide what price we list your home for tonight. You will decide, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, what price we list your home for. Why? Because it's your money. It's your equity position. You worked hard to make this home as beautiful as it is. It's your decision what price we list your property for. My job as a realtor, your job as a realtor, is to do diligence, to research the market, and to find comparables that are representative of what that seller's property is worth. You're bringing to the seller what the market says. Ultimately, you, Mr. Seller, will decide what price we list your home for tonight. But the flip side of that is that the market will decide what price they're prepared to pay for your property. Now I'm going to repeat that again, because this is the nicest transition that I've ever heard to presenting the comps. When you hear, I'm going to repeat this again because it's so important. When you get the seller's price opinion, which you're going to do strategically, and the seller gives you a higher price than what you know you have in your folder, or if they don't give you a price, you can bank on the fact that that number is probably higher than what you have in the folder. As soon as you're at that point, you've got to say to the seller, you've got to say, I just want to make one thing clear before I present the comps. I appreciate your price opinion. I appreciate the fact that you don't want to give me the number. But one thing I want to make very, very clear before I share with you these comps, and that is that ultimately, tonight, you will decide what price we list your property for. You're going to decide, not me. It's your money. It's your equity. You will decide what price we list your property for. My job is to bring to you what the market is saying about the value of your property. These are not my numbers. These are the market's numbers. Ultimately, you will decide what price we list your property for. But the flip side of that, Mr. and Mrs. Jones, is that the market will decide what price they're prepared to pay. And with that being said, let's take a look at what the market's saying. And then you go right into the comps. With that being said, Mr. and Mrs. Jones, let's take a look at what the market's saying. Boom, and you present the comps. That's a very smooth transition from, pre-warning them about the fact that they make the decision. So now here's the reality of this. Even though the numbers that you pull out then, even if those numbers are much higher than what the seller, if those numbers are much lower than what the seller was anticipating, they're not your numbers. And the seller knows that ultimately it's going to be their decision what price they list the property for. And here's the key to this. And then it's going to be your decision whether you want to take the listing at all. Now, you're not going to say that, but remember, there is no merit, ladies and gentlemen, in taking overpriced listings. Okay? We all take them if they're marginally overpriced, if they're within 10% of the highest comp, if they're within 10% of the highest comp, if it's a nice property and it's well kept and it's in a nice neighborhood, I would take it all day long. But I set certain expectations if I did. But if the seller's price opinion is ridiculously overpriced and they're not prepared to move from that number, you've got to make a very tough decision. And only you can make that decision sitting there knowing what's going on in that neighborhood. Remember one thing. One reason to take an overpriced listing is if Fillmore doesn't have any listings in that neighborhood. Why is that? It's a foothold and it's free advertising. It's free advertising in a market area, so that's one reason to take an overpriced listing. Another reason to take an overpriced listing is if you have a very good sense that the seller is open to revisiting the buyer appointment activity, which I'm going to talk about in a second, but there's some questions.
One thing about the overpriced listing, if they don't want to listen to the comps and you decide you might want to take it, you once said, write the comp number on the side of the sheet.
Absolutely. That's after you've taken the listing. Great point. I'm going to bring that up. Question?
Yes. If you have a seller, a prospective seller on the phone, and if this seller is adamant, and they are, say, and I don't know what, you said 10% of the highest comp. Let's say they are $80,000 above the highest comp.
Well, if it's an $800,000 property, then that's 10%.
No, I'm talking 600,000.
Okay.
To 650.
Yeah.
And they're about $80,000 to $100,000 above
Right.
the highest comp that's sold. And they're telling you on the telephone that they are adamant that they have a way out, that they will not sell any lower.
What did I tell you?
Do you go down there?
What did I tell you before? Never talk about price over the phone. Never talk about price over the phone. It's a kiss of death. It's a total lose-lose proposition. Never talk about price over the phone, because at least you're going to be able to get a face-to-face with the buyer. Excuse me, a face-to-face with the seller. You'll be able to get a face-to-face with him. So be careful about that. Now,
Question.
yes.
They always ask me first, like, how about the prices of the neighborhood? What are they going for? One.
They ask you over the phone?
No, like you have a conversation with them, you meet someone, and
Right.
you do flyers.
Right. The goal, remember, the goal in getting a listing is to get into their property and be in a position to make a formal, well-thought-out presentation like what we talked about the other night. That's the goal, okay? So even if you're at your place of worship, or you're at a function, and someone says, what's going on in my neighborhood, I know you work in this market area, so you know what? It's such an important discussion, it's so dynamic. What I'd love to do would be to come over to your property, let me run some comparables, let me get some current information, let me research the for sale by owners that are currently on the market, and that way we can talk in an educated fashion. So try not to get into those casual sidebar conversations, because oftentimes you can dig a hole for yourself and you can't get out of it. Okay? It's a great question, and I know, you and I, we want to sound smart when we're talking to our friends, and we want to sound professional, but it even sounds more professional when you say, let me go home, let me do some research, let me drill down, let me get under the hood a little bit, and then I'll come over to your property, and then we can compare and contrast your property to some of these that are on the market. Okay? Great question. Great. It's a real life question, and one that many of us would fall prey to if not asked. Very good question. Yes.
How much time do you usually have from the time you schedule an appointment to actually presenting and doing a research?
Well, you want to make sure that you give yourself enough time.
And what would?
No. Just between the time to go ahead and prepare yourself. I would say, 4 or 5 days. 4 or 5 days. I mean, considering you're busy. I mean, if you're not busy, you can pull all this together in a matter of days. But again, you want to give yourself 4 or 5 days, because I really implore you to do this. You want to physically go out and visit the comps, gain access to the property, visit the FSBOs, walk around the neighborhood a little bit, get a sense of whether the market value in that neighborhood is going up or it's going down, gentrifying or not. All right? Now here's the key. Here's the key. So you've gone ahead and you've laid it out for them, that ultimately they will decide what price that we list their home for tonight. And that's having a positive attitude. Get into the habit of saying that when you're with the seller. Ultimately you will decide what price we list your home for tonight. That's like a positive statement. Everybody see what I did there? So they haven't told me they're going to list their property with me, but I'm having a positive attitude. I'm trying to plant a subliminal seed in their head. So you're going to point that out, and then you're going to review the comps. Now here's the key. After you review the comps, those 8-10 comps, and the range is between 400 and 480. Okay, the range of your comp is between 400 and 480. Your question to the seller after you've gone through that. Now, even though the seller gave you their price opinion, that their price opinion was 550 before you presented the comps. Let me make sure you're all with me on this, okay? The comps that you present are between 400 and 480. 10 minutes ago, the seller went ahead and told you that they felt that the value of their property was 550. So now you presented the comps between 400 and 480. After you present the comps, you're going to actually forget that they told you 550. And you're going to say, tell me, where do you think your property fits in this range? Where do you think your property fits in this range? And typically, they come down off of that number. Now, if remember they said 550 before you presented the comps. The comps are between 400 and 480. You say, so tell me, where do you think your property fits in this range? and they say, well, you know, I told you before 550, but now maybe if looking at this, maybe it's 520. And so still they're above the comps. You have to ask them. Don't be bashful. Ask them, how did you arrive at that number? Always ask them how they arrived at that higher number than the comps, even though you've substantiated it. They said they came down from 550 to 5. Well, maybe it's not 550. Maybe around 525. Your highest comp was 480. Can I ask you how you came to that number of 525? They'll give you the substantiation. Now here's the key. Please remember this. This is the key. So here we are. We've gotten them down to 5 1/4. 480 is the nearest highest comp. You're within that 10% range, you know, barely in that 10% range. You want to take the listing. Here are the words, and I urge you to try to memorize these words if you possibly can, okay? Try to memorize these words. I'm prepared. I'm prepared. Well, go to page 3, because I actually have them written down. Okay? Take a look at the second paragraph. Okay? And see where I say, how did you arrive at that number? Okay? Go down a couple lines where it's quote unquote, I'm prepared. Folks, I'm prepared to take your listing tonight at that 5 1/4 number that you suggest, under one condition. I'm prepared to take your listing at 5 1/4 tonight under one condition. And that is that you're open to revisiting, you're open to reviewing the buyer appointment activity on a weekly basis with me. I promise you that once a week, come hell or high water, we'll have a teleconference call and I'll review the activity on your property. If we're going to review phone calls, we're going to review emails, we're going to review page impressions on your web page, we're going to review physical visits by realtors, by buyers, we're going to get their opinions, open house feedback, we're going to get feedback. If we're not getting the activity on your property, then we're going to have to revisit our strategy. As long as you're open to revisiting the buyer activity, then I'm prepared to take your listing right now. And if they don't say anything, when a seller doesn't say anything, you know what that means? Yes, that means it's done. This is the oldest selling skill in the world. When you propose something and that buyer or the seller don't say anything, that means yes. Just go for the paperwork. Just go for the paperwork. Now here's the key. Here's the key with this. The seller is open to revisiting the buyer activity on a weekly basis. You're going to be able to build a case for price reductions. If they say, no, 5 1/4, that's my number. If you're not, if I can't, I'm not taking a penny less than 5 1/4, then you've got a difficult decision because you've got an obstinate seller. And only you can make that call based upon the factors that we talked about before. If Fillmore doesn't have any inventory in that neighborhood, if you don't have any listings, and you're prepared to take a beating every week, take a beating. Take a beating from that seller every week, then take that listing. Now here's the key. Never, ever, 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 ever mention price reductions at the listing table. You didn't hear me say those words at all. Never mention a price reduction. Some agents will say, well, if we're not getting the activity, then we're going to have to reduce the price. No! Don't go there. What I suggested that you say is effectively the same thing, but without using the term price reduction. Let me do it again for you, okay? Everyone in this room can do it. I don't care if you're Russian, I don't care if you're Chinese. Put it in your own terms. I'm prepared to take your listing tonight, Mr. and Mrs. Jones, under one condition. I'm prepared to take your listing at that 5 1/4 price, which is some $45,000 over the nearest highest comp. I'm prepared to do it on one condition. I'm prepared to take your listing tonight under one condition, and that is that you're open to revisiting, open to reviewing the buyer appointment activity, the buyer email activity, the web impressions, the feedback, etc., on a weekly basis. And if we're not seeing the activity, what do you think the market's telling us? Now, if they say that, then you got them. You got them. I want you to ask that question. If we're not seeing the activity on your property, and go through it, telephone calls, emails, page impressions, buyer visits, realtor visits, open house activity, if we're not seeing the activity, what do you think the market is telling us? Pause for a second. And many of them will say, well, maybe it's overpriced. Maybe it's and as soon as they say that, here's the close. Here's the close. Listen to me carefully. As soon as they say, well, no, maybe it's overpriced. What you say is, there's only one way to find out. Let's get your property on the market. Reach for the listing agreement and start filling it out. That's the close. That's the close. You never say, so would you like to list your home? Go for the close. Just reach for the paperwork. Have some guts. Just turn and have the paperwork handy. Even have a portion of it filled out already. Okay? Just pick it up and start writing, saying, all we need is some basic information and go for it. Okay? Just go for it. Question.
Okay. Take a step back to the part where you're asking the buyer's opinion.
The seller's opinion.
The seller's opinion of the price.
Right.
And they tell you, well, we think it's this and this. Higher than what you have, you show
Right.
the comparables, and then you ask them, how did you arrive at that price?
Right. Now remember something. Here's one key. Let me clarify one point. You don't ask them how they arrived at that point until after you presented the concept. But go ahead.
So
Go
let
ahead.
me say,
Go ahead.
they're saying that, well, yours is too low, I think, because your
Right.
comparables have 17 feet wide, and our house is 20 feet wide, and that should make a big deal in the price. Like, if it's something that your comparable is not exactly the same.
Right.
Let's say it's, a lot is like 40 by 100,
Right.
they have 50 by 100.
Right.
Would that effectively?
Yes, it would. Yes, it would. And frankly, they would move up higher in the comp range.
Right.
They move up higher in the comp range. Because oftentimes sellers will say, if they're compliant, they'll say, okay, so maybe my numbers were high. Where do you think I should be in the comp range? Okay? When a seller asks you where they think you should be, never give them a finite number. Never. You know why? Because if you do, and the property doesn't sell at that number, they're going to look at you and say, that was your number. That was your number. So what you want to say is that certainly, realistically, Mr. and Mrs. Cohen, because your property is 10 foot wider, your property should be in the higher end of that comp range. Where do you want to be? So always elicit the number from them. Never give them a number. But if their property has some value-added features, more width or depth on the physical plot, give them say higher. You should be higher in the range. Without giving them, you should be higher in the range. Where do you want to be? Let them choose the number. If they're within that range, let them choose the number of the range. Because then you can always use the same strategy to get them down. There were a couple questions here.
Yeah, how would you work in, at the point where you're discussing buyer activity?
Yeah.
How would you work in the fact that 20 people came through the house without making an offer? That scenario.
That tells the story. That tells the story. Let me back up a little bit. I'm going to treat that question, Deb, in a little bit more depth. It's a great question. Remember this, again, and please do this. On a weekly basis, we're going to review the web activity, the page impressions on your property. We're going to review the telephone calls, any emails that may come in, appointments that were made, feedback from both the realtor that brought that buyer in and from the buyer. And every week, I'm going to report to you. Okay? Now, if there's no physical buyer appointments that week, but there were 24 page impressions. Everybody know what a page impression is? That means that someone clicked on to their web page on Fillmore's website. If there were 24 page impressions, and no calls, and no emails, and no buyer visits, what's that a clear sign of? Overpriced, and here's why. I want you just to think about this. Just think about this. You're a buyer, you plug in criteria, you want to live in Gravesend, you want to be between 500 and 550, you want this criteria in a property, you click a button, up pops 10 properties. And you start going through the properties. You look at the first property, and because it's in Gravesend and it's in the price range that you want to be in, you look at the property, you look at the price, you read the description, you look at the pics, and you say, you don't think it's worth it. What do? You click off. That's a page impression. Now, if the seller has had 24 page impressions that week, and no calls, and no emails, and no physical activity, it's very, very clear that buyers don't see the price-value relationship. Write that word down. You never tell a seller that their property is overpriced. Never, ever, 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 ever. It's like telling them they have an ugly baby. Never, never tell a seller their property is overpriced. You just want to point out the fact that buyers obviously are not seeing the price-value relationship. Price-value relationship. Buyers are not seeing the price-value relationship. That's why they're not coming. That's why they're not calling. They look at your property online, and quite frankly, Mr. and Mrs. Cohen, Fillmore is doing their job, because a realtor's job is to bring buyers' eyes to your property. That's what a realtor's job is, to bring a buyer's eyes and realtor's eyes to your property. We're doing our job. Buyers are coming and looking at your property online on your personalized web page, but they're not seeing the price-value relationship. That's why they're not taking the next step. It's a compelling argument. It's a very compelling argument, and Fillmore has the tools for you here to use. Now, I would urge you, once you take the listing, you must have a dialogue with the seller every single week. And if the property's overpriced, it's almost good news that you have no activity, because it helps validate the fact that what you said at the listing appointment, when you said if sellers choose to overprice their property, we're not going to see any buyer activity on the property. So you're only validating what you told them in the listing appointment. Okay? Yes? All right. It's very, very important to do that. Now, I'm going to go over this one point once more, and we're done. Okay? Except for the couple points on page 4. And go over it again because it's so important. I just want to reinforce this. I know I've said it a couple times tonight. Let me just reinforce it. The comp range that you present is between 400 and 480. 5 minutes before you presented the comps, you asked the seller for their price opinion, and they said they think their property is worth 550. You don't ask them at that point how they got to that number because you haven't presented your comps yet. Your comps are between 400 and 480, and they feel as though their property is worth 550. You go through presenting the comps, and you say, as you can tell, Mr. and Mrs. Cohen, the comps here, as we reviewed, are between 400 and 480. Tell me, where do you think your property fits in that price range? And they're going to say, well, you know, we said 560 before, 550 before, maybe 5 and a quarter. Only at that point do you say, how did you arrive at that number? After you presented the comps. How did you arrive? After you show them the comparables, say, where do you think your property fits in this range? Now, that's even though they told you 10 minutes earlier, 560. Because hopefully they've changed their mind a little bit now that you've validated what's going on. They say, we think our property is, well, maybe not 550, but at least 5 and a quarter. At that point in time, you ask them, how did you get to that number? And they'll say what they're going to say. They'll say what they're going to say. And you can say, well, you know, your property does have some value-added features in it, and I'm prepared to take your listing tonight under one condition. And be dramatic. Pause. I'm prepared to take your listing tonight under one condition. And they're going to say, what? They always say what. They always say what.
I know what that is.
Then you know what? I'll tell you what. You're using silence as a tool. Most salespeople feel as though they got to talk. Use silence as a tool. It's a great tool. Because you know what you're doing. They don't know what you're doing. They always talk. I'm telling you. I've done this 1,000 times. They always talk. Always. Always. Come on, women. You know it. You know it. When you don't talk to your man, they always talk. Okay, always. Question.
So like if you have listing in that same neighborhood, and and you know what you have, yours is overpriced and the other one is in the right price range,
Right.
you can take the homeowner to visit that
Absolutely,
property.
absolutely,
So, you know,
absolutely. And you know,
compared to
typically they have,
Yeah.
being nosy at open houses,
Yeah.
but you would have reviewed that
I got
anyway.
a price break by that.
Absolutely, great point. Let me just finish this point, and then we can have the questions. We'll finish the last couple. I just want to reinforce this point. I'm prepared to take your listing tonight under one condition, and that is that you're open to reviewing the buyer appointment activity on your property on a weekly basis. I will call you religiously once a week. We'll review the page impressions on your property. We'll review the telephone calls. We'll review the emails. We'll review physical buyer appointments, and we'll get their feedback. We'll even get realtor feedback on your property. And if we're not seeing activity, then what do you think the market's telling us? Okay, and pause there, and if they say overpriced, at that point in time, you move right for the close. You say, well, there's only one way of finding that out, let's get your property on the market, and you reach for the paperwork. Okay? Question?
Would you tell, give them a range of your comparables,
Yes.
and then you tell them, I'm prepared to take this.
No, you're going to ask them, how did you get to that number?
After all
And
that.
then they're going to say, well, I did this, that, and the other thing.
Right, and then you say, I'm prepared to take the listing on.
But before you say that, you say, when they, certainly your property has some elements that make it special, that should push it on the higher end of the price range, and I'm prepared to take your listing at the price you want under one condition.
Does that make the seller think, he's gonna take it because he really thinks my house is worth what I'm saying?
No, no, because right after that, you're gonna say, one thing that we're going to do, I'm gonna take it on one condition, and that is that we're gonna review the buyer activity on your property every week. And if we don't see the buyer activity, what do you think the buyers are telling us? Okay?
They're not thinking that
No,
he'll take
no,
it.
not if you do it just like I said to do it, okay? Because what you're saying, now hear me out on this. I know this is new for a lot of you. Hear me out on this. Hear me out on this. You're going to tell the seller that I'm prepared to take your listing under one condition. That is that you're open to revisiting the buyer appointment activity on a weekly basis. And you're going to go through the various types of buyer activity you're going to report on. If we don't see that activity, Mr. and Mrs. Jones, if we don't see the buyers coming to your property, and we don't see the telephone calls, and we don't see the emails, what do you think the market is telling us? And then if they say that, if they say, well, maybe it's overpriced. If they say, well, maybe you're not doing your, I've had people say to me, well, maybe you're not doing your job. And then I'd say, a realtor's job is to bring eyeballs to your property. And if we're not seeing any page impressions on your property, then I'll take the responsibility of not doing the job. But that's not going to happen. You're going to see page impressions. You're going to see page impressions. Does everybody know what a page impression is?
We get a print off on that?
You go within every property with Fillmore's new website. You know what the page impressions are on your listings. Okay? Yes. Yes. And you call them. You don't physically go there. You call them. Yes.
Do you try to revisit the price at that point?
No.
Well, do you wait like 2 weeks?
Let's talk about price reductions. Turn to page 4. Okay. One of the things that you want to do is you want to keep the seller abreast of new competing properties that come on the market. Okay? Remember something. Numerous small price reductions are no good. Many small price reductions are no good. Why do you think they're no good?
You're chasing the market.
Because you're chasing the market, and buyers who see this, and buyers see this, they're just going to wait for the next one. They're going to wait for the next one. Okay? So the only way to get price reductions are deep price reductions. Now, I'll give you a tip on this. In the Brooklyn MLS, buyers shop in what price increments?
50.
It's 50, right? It's 50 over a certain number. It's $50,000. So buyers shop from $499 to $550 or $549. From $550 to $599, right? Yes? Okay. Whenever you get a price reduction, you want to go down to the next bar, to the next level. Because if you go from $499 to $475, the same buyers are looking at that property. Because when they search in $50,000 increments. Everybody get that? Very, very important. You always want to try to get down to the next bar. On some websites, you shop in $25,000 increments below a certain price. You always want to get down below the next bar, the next plateau, because it's counterproductive if you do so, if you don't do so, because the same buyers are looking at the property. They're not going to react. If they were going to react, they would have reacted to the $499 price. Okay, question?
Well, just, if you go down to the next bar, then you're at the higher end of the next bar. Those buyers that are looking in that range might think, well, you know, it's too pricey for me, maybe I'll wait for it to come down.
But the point is that the same buyers are looking at that $50,000 increment anywhere in that increment. You want to get down to the next bar, so you get a whole new pool of buyers looking at the property.
These are buyers, though, that, you know, have a different price range. If I'm a buyer in the previous price range, and it comes down to the lower end of my price range, when I might...
Let me give you an example.
Yeah.
If you brought the price down to $399, okay? The property was at $435. You bring it down to $399. You with me?
Yeah, yeah.
Bring it down to $399. Those buyers who are looking at the $375, $380 range would never have been looking at the $435 price, but they are going to be looking at the $399 price. So you're introducing a whole new portfolio of buyers to look at the property. Okay? I mean, trust me on this.
All right, no.
This is the way it works.
Wouldn't it be worthwhile to mention
Say what?
that other brokers, the brokers who are showing people the property, they mentioned that this property was recently being reduced?
I'm not sure if I understand the question.
That's not kind of question. I'm saying, wouldn't it be worth your while?
Yeah.
For you to mention to the seller that brokers normally point out the reduction?
Yeah, sure. Sure. And you know, always try to tie in an open house with a price reduction as well. Always a good thing to do. You know, we're remarketing the property. Question?
If you're talking about a lower price property, however, still co-op, then you're not talking $50,000. Wouldn't it be based more on a percentage range? Then you're not going to reduce a co-op that's, say, a studio co-op by $50,000.
No. But I mean, there's not that many. Let's face it. The average price in Brooklyn is $400,000. So you know, you got to look at the critical mass. With that kind of situation, then obviously you're going to bring it down whatever increments that make sense within the comp range. Okay. Question.
I said once before, if your comps were 60,000 less than what they wanted, and you took the listing, then you would write down their price, and then on the side margin, you would bring them back to that price.
Exactly. Here's the point that we wanted to revisit. Now you've gone ahead and you've taken the listing, okay? They've got the beautiful new Fillmore brochure in front of them, okay? One thing that's always a great thing to do is you take the brochure back, their brochure back, and you've gone ahead and you're going to list their property at that 5.25 number. Your comp range was between 400 and 480. A great thing to do is right on the cover, grab their brochure cover back, and right on the cover, you know, you may write down when you're going to hold the first open house and the first time that you're going to call them to set the teleconference and discuss the feedback. Also write down the comp range, right on the cover. Write down, you know, comps were 400 to 480. Okay? And the reason why you do that is because a month down the road, these sellers have selective memory about what you discussed in the meeting. And when they say, we're not getting activity, we're angry, we're not getting activity, say, can you grab that brochure cover? You must have it around somewhere handy. Just revisit that price range of the comps that I presented. That's the reason why we're not getting the buyer appointment activity. And you know, I tried to make that very clear at the listing table in your property when we brought up your listing. It's a great thing to do. Yes?
Try to get the seller to come down in price, like you said, you want to come down $50,000.
Well, you want to come down to the next bar. It may not be $50,000.
Okay. It's very hard.
It is.
They say, oh, what do you want me to give it away?
No. And when they say, what do you want me to give it away, I'm going to say, absolutely not. We want to try to get as much money for your property as we possibly can, but again, it's not me, it's the market. It's not me, it's the market that determines what price your property is going to sell for. And if we're not getting activity, we're not getting offers on your property, the market is telling us something. That's something you've got to say over and over and over and over and over again to the seller. It's not me. I don't want you to give your property away. But buyers are savvy today. Buyers are only going to pay what the market bears. And if we're not getting offers on your property, we're not getting activity, the buyers are not seeing the price-value relationship. Now, you've got to say this over and over again until you're tired of saying it, because that's the only way to justify a price reduction, through activity or lack of activity.
But most of the time, like, if you, just as how we have serious buyers, we have serious sellers too.
Yes.
And if the seller is really serious about selling her, his or her property, they will negotiate the price reduction.
They will.
So some of them, they're really not that serious.
Some of them are not. Some of them are not. And that's something that you should have ascertained from the class two times ago when we talked about asking questions. What's motivating your property on the market? Where are you guys moving to? You'll know this before you ever get this far. Okay? You'll know that. You'll know that before you ever get this far. Okay? Just a couple last things on page 4. Regular feedback is the only way to build a case for price reductions. Keep great records of buyers who viewed the property. This is very, very important. I don't know if a lot of realtors do this, but every time a Coldwell Banker agent or a Century 21 agent wants to show the property, you've got to make it very, very clear to them that I'll get you to the property, here's the showing and availability instructions, but please give me a phone call and give me not only your buyer's opinion of the property, but also your opinion. Because that's two pieces of information that you're going to plug into the seller's dashboard so the seller can see that information. That's the basis upon which you're going to get price reductions. That's the only way, by getting feedback. And I hate to say this, you probably have to call them because most realtors are dolts. But what you must do is, it doesn't preclude you for asking at the same time while you're helping them gain access to the property. Okay? You've got to do it. You've got to do it. And I hate to say this, but the sellers oftentimes are more influenced by other realtors' opinions than yours. Because all they think is that you want to make a commission and make a big killing. It's other realtors' opinions that are even more valuable than yours after you've taken the listing. So make sure you get both pieces of feedback, submit them independently. So you have a lot of feedback all saying the same thing. You can create a compelling case to get price reductions. Now you can't get a price reduction unless you've built a case. And the case is lack of telephone calls, lack of emails, and I know it sounds redundant, but you got to go through all of those things. If they're getting a lot of page impressions, a lot of views, and they're not getting physical activity, it's so easy to make a case for a price reduction. Okay? Question?
So then just taking 2 steps back, trying to get into the door.
Yeah.
You said 4 or 5 days prepping.
You know, what I'm saying is that it depends on how busy you are, but you want to visit the comps, you want to visit the comps.
I understand that, but if you do wait 4 or 5 days, and then go into a whole slew of appointments, and then you pull up to confirm and they say, sorry.
Okay, let's back up a little bit. Let's back up a little bit. If the seller calls you up and says, I want you in my property tomorrow, you're going to go in tomorrow and make half of a presentation, and then come back with the comps and all that due diligence. I make it a two-step thing. There's some companies that I do work for that have a standard 2-step process. They go in first and they don't present comps. They make their presentation, but they don't present comps, and they come back the second time. All right. Any other questions?
We're assuming that everybody is going to be overpricing the comps.
Yes.
What is first, and it's true both.
Right.
What if somebody is within it?
Okay, great. Listen. One last thing. This is very important, everybody. It's a great question. Give me your attention for 30 seconds more, okay? It's very early. We're only been here for a little bit. Here's the point. once you present the comps, you say, where do you think in this range you fit, and they say, well, here, right in this range, you're gonna lather them with compliments, saying, you really know the market, Mr. and Mrs. Jones. I am very, very impressed. You're right on point. Okay? So you feel good. All right, everybody? Good night. Good night.